Welcome to our web development class. We will continue with CSS3 backgrounds and gradients. The background clip property, which is not in the book, determines where the background image covers. If you look at the diagram here, we have content, we have some padding, and we have a border. By default, when you insert a background image, it starts at the edge of the border box and covers everything inside. With the background clip property, we can tell it to start at certain places or to cover certain places. The default would be border box. We can tell it to start at the padding box or the content box. Essentially covers, not starts. And the property for this is the background clip property. So here it controls how the background image is displayed in a container with respect to the border, padding, or content. The background origin property, very similar to background clip, determines where it begins. So here again, if we look at our diagram that has a container, content, padding, and border, we can position the background relative to either the border, padding, or content. Here again, the default is to the border, and we can position it in to start at different points. Now this is the background origin property. We still have the background position property, which in addition to this would allow us to further manipulate the background image. The background size property, very nice in CSS3. Prior to that, you had no control other than Photoshop for controlling changing the background image size. Now we can actually go in and code it either with a pixel or percent value. Here again, the background size property will take two values. Should you apply just one value, that would apply to both the width and the height. The background size property also takes two other values. One is cover and one is contain. Cover, which is demonstrated in the diagram, forces the background to cover the whole area. You commonly see this in websites where the whole background, regardless of the size of the screen, is covered by an image. The value contain is similar to cover. It will put that image in to the best of its ability once. Now the cover value will definitely skew the image in order to cover it. Setting the background size to cover does not need the background repeat set to none. However, if you were to set the background size to contain, you would also need to set the background repeat to none, because as you may remember, by default the background repeats. Multiple background images. Another nice addition from CSS3. This allows us to add additional background properties in the same container. So if you take a look at our diagram here, we have a background, and in the middle of it we have a sheep. Underneath it there is a URL from where this example is taken, and it's also an excellent resource for some commonly used CSS3 properties. Alright, so taking a look at our CSS code, the background image property is set to two values. Notice that these values are comma separated. The first value is the URL of the first image. The second value is the URL of the second image. And let me point out that the second image is behind the first. If you were to reverse these, you might not see the first image or the second image, because if it's in the wrong position, depending on the sizes, one might overlap the other. And this is not limited to two. You can do 3, 4, etc. They are all comma separated. So for example, if you have two background images, and then you want to set some additional background properties, you would also need to set them for both images. For example, here we have the background position property set for the first image, which is the sheep, to center bottom. Notice the sheep is the foremost image. The second one is set to left top, which happens to be the default. Even if it is the default, you still need to put it. If you only have one value for a background position and you have two images, that value will apply to both, and that's not necessarily what we want. But notice, for example, we have a background repeat property, and here it is set to repeat. We only have one value. This value, no repeat, will apply to both the sheep background and the sky background. However, that is the effect we want. Alright, now let's take a look at background gradients. In the past, we would go into Photoshop, we would create a gradient, and we would insert that as a background image. Now we can use CSS to do this. And this is a real time saver with file size and bandwidth and HTTP request, which makes it ideal in a responsive layout. Alright, the one thing I would like to point out from the beginning is that a background gradient acts similar to a background image, meaning you can't have both. It's going to be one or the other. So if you code in a background image and then a background gradient and then a background image, the image will take precedence if that is the way your CSS is written. Alright, so the linear gradient is technically a value of the background property. So if you look at the syntax here, background colon, linear hyphen gradient, and it takes at least two parameters. You need at minimum two colors to make a gradient. However, there are other parameters that you can use. You can use a direction, which is in the form of an angle, or a position in which you might start the gradient, and you can also use some set some other values that we will see soon. So let's take a look at a default gradient. If you look at the diagram, you see our color red fading into blue. If you take a look at our CSS code, you will notice that we are writing it with the browser prefixes. Linear gradient is probably still a good idea to use vendor prefixes, although I tend to think that the current browsers recognize the W3C syntax, and when you use vendor prefixes, please make sure that the W3 syntax always goes last, because remember, the browser reads from top down, and with respect to the order of precedence, the last one will apply. So if the browser reads the W3 syntax, you want to make sure that that's the last one it reads so that it will apply it correctly. Now notice we are passing two values, two parameters to this linear gradient value, red, blue. Now at minimum, this is all you need. However, there are some defaults that are being set that you should be aware of. Number one, the gradient will start at the top. That is a default. It starts at the top and goes to the bottom. It is also working with what is called a 180-degree angle. So if from your old math days, I assume this is more of a geometry issue, a 180-degree angle is a horizontal line. So we are going straight down. The gradient will be 50% red and 50% blue. If it's not specified, the gradient will be that big. If there were three colors and it wasn't specified, it would be broken up into thirds. Notice that the gradient will stretch to fit the entire container. So if this gradient was in a small container as opposed to on the background page, it would look relatively different. Let's take a look at how we might create a gradient with a 90-degree angle. And notice now the red is starting in a different position. Let me just flip back to the other slide. Notice how the red is starting in here. This is the 180-degree angle, which is the default. Now we look on the left-hand side. This is a 90-degree angle. And notice in our syntax, the linear gradient value. Notice how that parameter is specified, 90 DEG, no spaces. And we have comma, red, comma, blue. So let's take a look at creating a gradient with a direction other than an angle. And we can make, and we are using different words to specify directions. And we have a combination of top, bottom, left, right. So let's take a look at what we have here. This looks like the first one we started out with. And if you look at the syntax, the parameter to bottom, comma, red, comma, blue. All right, to bottom is the direction that we're giving it. It means the gradient is going toward the bottom, and that is the default. So to bottom is a direction that you can specify. However, it is the same thing as saying 180 degrees, and it is also the default. Now let's take a look at a combination of bottom right. Notice that the gradient is starting at the top, and it's going in the angle toward the bottom right. Therefore, it's going to be on an angle in order to go to the right. It's not going down to the bottom, it's going down to the right. And if you look in the diagram, you can see the way the color is gradiating down. So our parameter to bottom right, comma, red, comma, blue. So there's all kinds of combinations that you can use to make different types of gradients. All right, now let's look at what are called starting points. Up to this point, we've only worked with two colors, and therefore they're distributed 50% each. However, you can distribute them to start at different points. So supposing we wanted our second color to start at 20%. Let's take a look at our syntax here. In the linear gradient value, in our parentheses, our parameters red, comma, blue 20%. That means that the blue will start 20% down, and you can see that happening, and eventually it's almost a solid blue. So you can create these starting points for your various colors. You can have, if you have 3 colors, you can have 2 starting points and more. You also can use multiple colors. And by the way, these are called color stops. And you Photoshop users this should be very familiar to Photoshop users because we make gradients all the time. Alright, so looking at our basic syntax using 3 colors, linear gradient, and our parameters red, comma, green, comma, blue. Very simple, from top to bottom, which is technically 180 degrees, to bottom, and we are distributing the 33.333% equally. Alright, so just some theory here. If the first color stop does not have any kind of length or percentage, and by the way, they can be pixels, it defaults to 0%. So you can set a color stop for the first one. If the last one doesn't have a length or percentage, it defaults to 100%. Alright, if it doesn't have a position anywhere in between, then it's just positioned approximately halfway, or with respect to how many stops you have, as the browser would do, even it out. So here's another example of colors, 2 color stops with percents. If you look in our syntax, we have yellow, which is essentially starting at 0%. Red starts 15% way down. Green starts at 45. And here again, it gets to the point where it's a relatively solid green toward the end. Repeating gradients, very gorgeous actually. So let's take an example. Let's take a look at how we did this. Alright, there's our diagram. It looks very nice. Okay, and we're using RGB colors here, which is fine, and actually you can use transparent colors also. Alright, so we have our first RGB value, which is a bluish. We have our second RGB value, which is another bluish, starting at 7%. And then we have our last RGB value, which is dark, starting at 10%. And the only thing that's making it, everything else is default with respect to the direction. And the, however, our value is repeating linear gradient. So by putting the repeating in front of our linear gradient, we can make it repeat very nicely. One thing I would like to say, everything is subjective to your content. So if you were to try to repeat something with like a 45% stop and a 60% stop, something like that, you don't have a whole lot of room left to repeat. Just pointing that out. When you have repeats, your values need to be small enough with respect to the area so that they can continue to repeat. If you have large starting points, high values for starting points, you're not going to be able to repeat. So here again, CSS, it sometimes gets more, the syntax is correct, it's the logic, we're just not thinking it through correctly. Okay, we also have radial gradients. Although linear is generally more common, we also have radial. Alright, so here again they function like an image. They are a value of the background property and they take some parameters. Here again the only required parameter is 2 colors. However, they do have an optional position, an optional size, and an optional shape. There are defaults to all of these. So the position would be centered. The shape is an ellipse. And the size would be cover. Alright, so let's take a look on the right in our diagram. There is our radial gradient. And we are using, in our syntax here, you see we have the vendor prefixes. And at the bottom we have the W3 syntax, radial hyphen gradient. And it takes 3 parameters, red, comma, green, comma, blue. Here again, there are 3 colors and they will be equally proportioned if no starting values are specified. And notice it's in a square. Even though it's radial, it's still inside a rectangular container, which all containers are, so that you would think that it would round up at the edges, but it doesn't. Squares out there. Alright, if you notice, the shape is an ellipse, and it does cover the area, and it starts in the center. So these are the defaults that are set. And all we have to do is tell it the 3 colors that we want to use. Here again, you can use 2 colors or more. Alright, here we are changing it to a circle. Let's go back and see the difference. There's the ellipse. And here's the circle. You see you have more edges on the right and left. And if you would notice, there's the syntax, circle, comma, red, comma, green, comma, blue. You also can do a repeating radial gradient, and isn't that nice? Alright, let's take a look at how we do that the same way we did the linear gradient by putting the word repeating in front of the value. And let's take a look at our start points. We have circle, comma, red, comma, green 10%, blue 20%. Here again, that's 30%, which means we have enough room to have this thing going around 3 times. Or maybe a little bit more, depending on the size of our container. If these start values were much higher, it may not be able to repeat. Alright, there's a lot more to gradients, and when you start getting into applying some of the different start positions, there could be some, even with the browsers that support CSS3 with the vendor prefixes, that's everyone other than Internet Explorer, there were some differences in some of the syntax with some of the additional parameters with respect to the W3 standard. So it can be complicated. And there is nothing wrong with using a very popular CSS3 gradient generator called ColorZilla, and the URL is here. And it also provides backward compatibility for Internet Explorer by inserting a IE4 filter so that it would somehow see something there. However, for progressive enhancement, as long as you have a default background color coded in first, if the browser does not understand the gradient, it will fall back to the background color. However, this gradient generator has a lot of gorgeous presets, and you just might want to visit it and experiment a little bit. To wrap up this chapter, the book talks about these sizable icons for responsive design that are implemented with the @FontFace family and specific CSS properties. A lot of our modern frameworks do this also. They come with a set of icons for easy insertion. And here again, they are all very nicely responsive. However, this particular set does cost a little bit of money, just letting you know. But the principle of these sizable icons for responsive design is widely implemented, as I said, in a lot of our frameworks out there today.